Basically, sexuality is a total expression of who you are. And it covers a whole lot of issues. And I hope you can see them. I'm sorry. It's things to do with body image. It's about love and affection. It's about identity, who we are. It's about desires, our attitudes, values, intimacy, sexual orientation as well, gender roles, as people have mentioned. The whole thing about eroticism. The whole thing's about rights, attraction, relationships, genitals. So it covers a whole lot of different things. And I think when people think about sexuality, especially when you're thinking about children with disabilities, it's like, we can't talk about this thing, because we think it's just about the sex act itself. But sexuality is so much more than that. So us as sexuality educators, we don't call it sex education anymore. It's sexuality education, because we're dealing with a whole lot of issues. It's about life skills, basically. What are some of the attitudes that we have about people with disabilities when it comes to sexuality?
So one of the myths that came out is that they can't have pleasure, like the whole eroticism thing.
Okay.
So I think it's one of the myths that people have, that someone with a disability can't get aroused or can't really engage in a sexual act.
Okay. What other beliefs is there around? So we've got the other extreme where we get children that are hypersexual or oversexed. And I was asked, is it because of their disability? And that's a belief that people have, that if for children with intellectual disabilities, they're oversexed, that they want to have sex all the time. There's also the belief with certain people with different mental illness, the medication is meant to make them horny all the time and they want to have sex all the time. So there's all these different beliefs that are around. And also I think another thing as well is we often talk about children with disabilities as being victims of abuse. We've also got to remember they can also be perpetrators as well. And that's something that has not really been discussed so far, but it's something also to consider. That we can't just think of children with disabilities just as the innocent party all the time. I mean, the Teddy Bear Clinic have come up with quite a few cases where children of intellectual disabilities are actually been perpetrators of abuse. But again, that's another thing we'd have to investigate. Why is it? Why have they become perpetrators? Okay, I'm just going to go to this side. And it just summarizes basically some of the attitudes that we've spoken about. The first thing is we've spoken about the fact that they're asexual, that they don't have sexual feelings, we can't experience sexual relationships. There's also the belief that they're not at risk of HIV, because if they're not sexual beings, they're not going to need to be tested for HIV. There's also the belief that children or adults with disabilities should not have children, because it's the belief that they'll pass that disability on. And probably 60 to 70% of the time, that's not the case. That's not going to happen. Also, as we've said before, that youth with intellectual disabilities are seen as being oversexed. So some people use that as an excuse not to give sexuality education to youth with disabilities, because they're worried that they will make them go and do these things even more. But what you find is that those that are oversexed, or supposed to be oversexed, they've not received any information about sexuality. They don't know boundaries between their own personal boundaries and the boundaries of others. So this is why I always believe that education is important no matter what the disability.
As you sit here today, think about your own attitudes. I mean, how would you feel if you walked into the gynecologist and there was a woman sitting in the waiting room with a severe physical disability? If you saw a person in a wheelchair coming out of a sex shop, if you saw someone who you would assume is not having sex buying condoms. We make those judgment calls all the time. And in a lot of the literature, what women describe, just linking to this whole thing of being asexual, is a lot of the experience of women, mainly with physical disabilities, who were pregnant. They would be treated with a very unfair judgment by healthcare workers in saying, well, either why are you pregnant, how did you have sex, or you must have been raped and that's why you're pregnant, because someone would only have sex with you if it was forced. So there's a lot of discrimination that's happening in our own thoughts. I mean, Paul showed me a video that was done in the States of young girls with physical disabilities and some of their mild intellectual impairments going to visit a sex shop. And it was such an interesting thought for me because to be absolutely honest, I've only been into a sex shop once in my whole life, and it's not something that I would imagine or assume people with disabilities to be doing. But why the heck not? And I think that's part of what we're talking about when we're saying like testing your own attitudes about it and testing your own, you've got these like preconceived thoughts that certain activities are off limits because of disability, and that's the whole reason why we believe in inclusion, is that there should actually not be that societal barrier to being able to participate with integrity in all aspects of societal life.
And I think to add on to that as well, is that each of us need to be aware of our own beliefs and value systems when it comes to sexuality. But we also need to be aware of how our beliefs and values might impact on the other people that we maybe work with or we serve. Okay. The other thing I want to bring up, and this is just, I saw this cartoon picture. The actual picture is drawn by a quadriplegic guy. I mean, I'm also a quadriplegic, but he uses his mouth to draw. And he actually drew a picture, and I thought this sums up very well the typical attitudes that people have when it comes to disability. So you can see there's a lady on crutches, and the person's there saying, "What do you mean you're a lesbian? We thought you were disabled." So it's this belief that, again, there's two things that are happening here. The first thing, this person's a sexual being and they're disabled, that can't be right. Also, there's the belief around sexual orientation. It's automatically assumed that if you're a person with a disability, then you must be completely heterosexual if you're going to have sex. But it's not the case. You get people who are transgender, you get people that are gay, you get them that are lesbian as well. So it's just to be aware that when our session, we're not just talking about heterosexuality as well. We're covering the whole lot of issues.
But what the Sexual Offences Act does is it defines a number of different types of conduct, right? And it takes those conduct and it breaks it up into smaller and smaller different subcontexts. And as you're going further down, you eventually get to the type of conduct that's criminalized. Okay, so at the very start of that diagram, what you're seeing is you have something called a sexual act, right? And the term sexual act is a generic term that covers pretty much anything you can imagine, right? Any kind of sexual conduct would fall within the definition of that. So to make it more specific, they have two very broad definitions which kind of go throughout the statute. Okay, and the first one is sexual penetration, which is the top one, which you can't see, and the second one is sexual violation. I think the next is also going to be useless. I think that might work. Okay. The difference between the two is they're trying to draw a distinction between sexual penetration, which refers, I think, very broadly to the sort of conduct that we might associate with rape. So it's vaginal intercourse, male-female vaginal intercourse. It's male-male anal intercourse. It's penetrative intercourse, or it's penetration with an object, generally a penis-shaped object. So that's a narrow category of conduct. Then you have a broader category of conduct called sexual violation. And into that category, the legislation puts all the remaining conduct, right? And when I say remaining conduct, I mean the whole range. Kissing, touching somebody's breasts, feeling up over their clothes, to anything like masturbation or whatever the case may be. It's a mop-up provision. It covers everything that isn't covered by sexual penetration. And the reason that the Act differentiates between sexual penetration on the one hand and sexual violation on the other hand is there are a bunch of different individual offenses that you can then commit depending on whether or not you've committed an act of sexual penetration or whether you've committed an act of sexual violation. I'd like to talk about the various specific crimes that people commit when they commit acts of unconsensual sexual penetration and when they commit acts of unconsensual sexual violation. So let's talk about sexual penetration first. Now the first kind of prototypical type of offense that's committed here is the offense of rape, right? And since this act was passed, in South Africa we recognize that women can get raped, men can get raped, transgendered persons can get raped. All people are capable of getting raped, right? And you are raped when somebody commits an act of sexual penetration against you unlawfully and intentionally and without your consent, right? So that's it's kind of, in the scheme of the act, it's probably the outside of offences against children, the worst sort of offence that you can commit. But then that's to be contrasted with what the act calls sexual assault. Now sexual assault is any sort of unlawful and intentional act of sexual violation. So we spoke about sexual violation being any sexual conduct that falls short of sexual penetration. Okay, so if you're in a nightclub and somebody makes unwanted advances on you and is kissing you against your will or groping you against your will, that's an act of sexual assault, right? And it would be because you're not consenting to it, and the person who's doing it is doing it unlawfully because you haven't consented to it, and is doing it intentionally, they're committing an act of sexual assault. Okay, and again, this is kind of the category that catches everything that doesn't fall within the definition of rape is going to fall within the definition of sexual assault. Now, like I said, it covers a wide range of things from unwanted kisses or slaps on the bum, which are still an offence, to things that would be far more invasive, right? But that fall short of rape. The way that that's dealt with in practice is if you are convicted of sexual assault, the conviction will be the same whether or not it was for an unwanted kiss or whether or not somebody was fingering somebody against their consent. But the sentencing stage, where the court decides this is how long you go to prison, or unfortunately this is how long you have a suspended sentence for, will take that distinction into account. The kind of gravity of the conduct will be used to determine in part what sort of penalty will be imposed on you. Okay.
Intellectual disability, we can then make a comparison between the two, the mental disorder. That would be, let's first think about the cause. The cause for intellectual disability would be atypical neurodevelopment. And usually it is like either while before birth, that something goes wrong in the development of the unborn fetus, or just after birth, that some complication can happen and that the neurodevelopment, the development of the brain does not go according to what is expected, and complications, the effect of the atypical development of the brain, therefore causes differences in development if you compare it to a child who doesn't have, or what somebody called a neurotypical child. And then obviously, because there is a deviation from the expected development, it results into consequences. And if those consequences are significant, then you will define it as an intellectual disability. But we are not going to we are just going to make the comparison. A mental disorder is a neurochemical imbalance. So the brain developed fine, but something happened in the brain that the neurochemicals got into an imbalance, and that causes the symptoms that we observe in the person. The second one that we are looking at is then the onset. When does it, and onset means when does it usually start? So, like I said, usually at birth or early childhood is the onset for an intellectual impairment, and then adolescence or young adulthood would be the time that we may expect a mental disorder to develop. The cause, if we look at the intellectual development, the cause is like stable and expected. If we know somebody has an intellectual disability, we expect that this is the kind of behavior or conduct that is associated with the intellectual disability, and the person will be like that because we get to know that person developing that way. But on the other hand, when the mental disorder sets in, when that neurochemical imbalance set in, then the person's behavior changed. So it is I almost want to say a pre-picture and a post-picture. So the symptoms are different to how the person was before the neurochemical imbalance, and therefore it is a change. You can see there is a change in the person's behavior or in the person's conduct. But as soon as this condition has been correctly diagnosed, medication is prescribed and things can go back to where it was before the neurochemical imbalance set in. And then lastly, I'll just say then the aim of intervention will be different, and that is also how you can kind of, as lay people, think about the difference between the two. Because the aim of intervention with people with a mental disorder would be to get them back to how they were before, if I can put that, before the imbalance struck them. Help them to get back to that place where they can function and they can do their things. And obviously then with medication. It usually is with medication. But on the other hand, if we think about a person with intellectual disability, what is the aim of intervention? Why are we all busy talking today? We are all talking about that, to reach and to maintain optimal personal independence in all life areas.
What a wonderful privilege to be here this morning and to be able to speak to you about a topic that lies, I think, very close to all of our hearts, and that's exactly why we are here today, is to try and make sure that we ensure equal justice for all people, also for people with disabilities. And then the area that we are particularly interested in is those individuals within the disability sphere who are non-speaking. In other words, the people with disabilities that have rely only on speech to make their needs and wants known. Okay, so I am going to do my best to share a very positive story with you in terms of what happened in this one specific case study that we were involved in. So I think the one important thing that we have to first of all say to each other is that the Medical and Dental Research Council, they actually found that only approximately 1 out of every 9 rape cases are actually reported to the police. So we know that we have these high statistics, but that is then, as we would say in Africa, only the ears of the hippopotamus. We know there's a big part of that hippo that is still under the water. And then while we also know that there's such a high incidence of people with disabilities that are prone to abuse and rape, that we are talking about figures of between 4 to 10 times more frequently than for people without disabilities. So we see this high proportion, but then on the other hand, we see very low rates of people actually disclosing and reporting the crimes. Now, there's a whole different range of reasons why we actually think that that is happening, and that is things like a lack of confidence in the criminal justice system. So we think we're going there, but nothing is really going to happen. Then there's also the stigma that's very often associated with the event. We know that sometimes the victims believe that they played some sort of part in this process and that they are to blame to some extent. We discrimination against people with disabilities. And then there's also a high level of dependence on a caregiver, very often by people with disability. And if the perpetrator is also the person who is providing financially for the household, it makes it very difficult to actually take that case a bit further. Okay, now there's lots and lots of different reasons for victimization, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because I really want to rather get to the case study and explain to you what we did in that specific case. Now, the first important thing is that the perpetrators realize that these individuals are not able always to call for help. And we have a saying that a silent victim is the perfect victim. We know that very often it's difficult for them to be able to communicate what happened. Very often they don't always have all of the vocabulary. They don't have the words to be able to say what somebody did to them. They might feel guilty because of the cooperation before the time. So if it's somebody that is known to you and you cooperate with some other things with this individual, it makes that whole relationship very difficult. Caregivers might feel that disclosing the abuse and the investigation will actually do more harm than good, because now this person has to relive this whole event. He has to stay busy with that event in his head. People keep on asking him about that event, and then we think that it's better to protect them by not allowing them to actually talk about what had happened. And then there's also this very incorrect perception that they are unable to testify on court. Just because you are unable to speak by using your natural voice does not mean that you cannot testify in court.